Stop the world!
Welcome to Stop the World. I'm David Wroe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
This week, Australia made international headlines, Liv, as you saw, when it revealed Iran had directed at least 2 anti-Semitic attacks in Australia using local criminals as proxies. And while this is new for Australia, it fits a growing pattern that we've seen in Europe, where Russia and to some extent Iran as well have been using the tactic of hiring what are in effect gig workers to carry out such operations as sabotage against other countries.
Yeah, it's been a significant week, Dave, and this is actually the first time since the end of the Second World War that Australia has expelled an ambassador. The additional concern about Iran's interference was the assessment that it was seeking to stoke division within Australian society. Both the use of proxies and the attempt to undermine social cohesion are well-known hybrid threat activities, and today's guest, Elisabeth Braw, is an expert on hybrid threats. She's written extensively on this kind of malign activity and has coined the term disposable agents to describe these gig workers. They're cheap, readily available, and can be used once and then discarded, with at least some degree of deniability for the state directing the operations.
Yeah, and it's all enabled by modern connectivity. So encrypted messaging apps, social media, cryptocurrency, tick, tick, tick. Elisabeth is a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Transatlantic Security Initiative.
That's a mouthful.
It is in the Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security. She writes widely, including in Politico, The Times, and Foreign Policy. She's the author of several books, including Goodbye Globalization, The Defender's Dilemma, and God's Spies. And she's got a new one coming out soon on subsea cables called The Undersea War.
And that phrase, the defender's dilemma, is very relevant here because Elisabeth goes into the way that hybrid warfare is deliberately asymmetric and puts the burden of finding a response very much on the victim. She calls it geopolitical gaslighting, which is another great phrase. Elisabeth also explains the benefits and tactics of using disposable agents, the purposes of sabotage to interfere in other countries and their politics, and on wider issues of global connectivity, and particularly the subject of her new book on subsea cables.
Yep, she's got a knack for coining great phrases. It was a great chat. Let's hear from Elisabeth Braw. Hope you enjoy it. Welcome to Stop the World. I'm here with Elisabeth Braw. Elisabeth, thanks for coming on.
Thank you.
So we want to talk today about connectivity and the range of threats and vulnerabilities that it introduces. Obviously, the way we're ever more connected, we have expanding connectivity across a whole range of forms. This lifts our standard of living. It provides us all sorts of opportunities, but at the same time, it means that there are new vulnerabilities and threats emerging all the time. And we'll talk about how that manifests. But the first example that I really want to spend some time on is this idea of a gig economy for troublemakers and the way that malign states are drawing on this, pool of talent in inverted commas. You wrote a great piece about this in Politico a few months ago, in which you used the term disposable agents. It was a really useful term and very suitable. And as I say, it's timely for this conversation because as you know, the Australian government expelled the Iranian ambassador this week after discovering that Iranian Revolutionary Guards had been behind at least 2 arson attacks with anti-Semitic purposes to sow division and undermine social cohesion, and they used these sorts of proxies or disposable agents to carry out these attacks. It's not even clear completely whether the perpetrators knew that they were ultimately working on behalf of the Iranian regime, but. I think that's unclear at the moment. But anyway, it's a fascinating case. So I want to sort of talk a little bit about this issue because you're clearly the right person to discuss it with. Perhaps we can start with the question of why. I mean, why do Iran, Russia, in the case of Europe, probably others as well, use these disposable gig workers, and what are the main upsides compared with using, say, more traditional methods of interfering in another country?
There are so many upsides, and I have to say, it's now that it's beginning to happen, or that now that it's happening widely. I'm asking myself why it hasn't been happening before, because it makes so much sense if you are a country or a regime trying to destabilize another country to do it this way, in addition to other ways, obviously. But by doing it this way, you you cause physical harm, so to whatever the installation is, whether it's a company, a piece of infrastructure, you cause that damage, and we have seen a range of companies targeted, from a massive shopping mall in Poland to parcel bombs being deposited at DHL facilities or DHL locations in different places in Europe. So you can cause physical damage and obviously fear among the people working there, even if the physical damage is limited. But then you also cause fear across society, because people feel that anybody can strike anywhere, and clearly they will tell themselves the government is not capable of preventing this from happening. But why is it not capable of preventing this from happening? Because the people perpetrating it can be anyone, and that's what another reason makes so much sense. So in the past, hostile states have used essentially people affiliated with them for a long time to do whatever they needed to get done. And that was essentially intelligence gathering. So you would have sleeper agents, you would have people who were ideologically affiliated with that country would essentially spy for them over years. But this is different. This is a way of causing harm, and the people who cause that harm are not affiliated with that regime, whether it's Russia, Iran, or any other country, for a long time. They come in, they do one gig, as it were, and then they fade back into society. So it can be anyone needing a bit of money, which is why we have seen a lot of young people conducting or perpetrating these attacks. Here in the UK, for example, 3 young men were just convicted of such an attack on behalf of Russia. And the way they are recruited is a result of the way we live today, which is that there are social media platforms, apps, where Russian officials or any other officials can essentially connect with these people. They can offer a gig, and then the person carries out that gig, takes a photo, just like any other worker in our modern economy takes a photo of whatever it is that has been accomplished, just like the delivery guy takes a photo when he has delivered a parcel to your door, and they take a photo, send it back to whoever commissioned them. They get paid, and that's it. How are our governments supposed to be able to identify these people before it happens? It's almost impossible.
It's fascinating. And look, let's stick with the process for a moment, because that's a really interesting part of it. And a couple of things come to mind for me. I mean, encrypted messaging apps are obviously a key tool. It's a way for them to communicate. But how might they typically find these gig workers in the first place? I mean, are there sites, are there dark websites, something like this, where people advertise their quote unquote talents? And in terms of the payment, I mean, is that a way for authorities to at least potentially track it after it happens? I mean, is cryptocurrency typically involved, or is it are there just ways of paying without it being easy to trace? Just talk a bit more about the process.
Yeah, so it's essentially like the legally functioning gig economy, but a parallel gig economy where everything is a bit more opaque, obscure, and obviously illegal. So we are not exactly sure of every detail. Obviously, the people involved in it on the Russian side and other hostile states do it precisely so that it can remain hidden. But what we do know is that, as you said, they initiate the contact on messaging apps, social media, but then it moves it usually moves then to encrypted apps where they can carry out the actual organization or commissioning of the deed. And then as for the payment, this is another reason that cryptocurrencies are so often subversive to our societies, because in the past, as we all know, it was relatively easy for the police, for law enforcement authorities to track payments. But with crypto, it's just so much harder. But it's not completely impossible to trace these, to trace the hostile state connections of the perpetrators. For example, in the case of the UK arson attack, the three men who were just convicted, they were convicted of the attack, and the investigators also managed to establish that they had been commissioned by Russia. The same thing was true with the arson attack against the massive shopping mall in Poland. Several months ago, last year, 2024, the investigators also managed to establish that they had been commissioned by Russia. The perpetrators had been commissioned by Russia. So it is possible. It's just so much harder. And again, because the connection between the perpetrators and the commissioning state is so fleeting, it's just sort of a momentary interaction, and obviously not even a personal interaction. It's so much harder than it used to be back in the day, finding people spying for a hostile country. We were talking about years-long associations, and now it's a minutes-long association, or a few days, but very, very limited.
Okay, all right. Tell us a bit about the sort of range of jobs that are carried out using this particular vector. I mean, the examples we've talked about so far. I mean, arson is a typical one. So it's sabotage, basically. It's state-on-state sabotage there. How far does it go? I mean, are diasporas targeted? Are political opponents targeted? And has it gone up to as far as cases of murder or assassination? I mean, I think back to the last case that we might think of in the UK that was very, very high profile, where trained agents, where trained officers were used, and that was of course the Skripal poisoning using Novichok, a clear assassination attempt, and it with deadly consequences ultimately. But I mean, are those sorts of tasks being given to these freelancers?
So, but the cases that have been proven so far have been cases of sabotage. So, arson, parcel bombs, and a really cunning case in Germany just before the election. There was a combination of sabotage and election interference, which was that all of a sudden car owners found that their cars, the exhaust pipes had been blocked. And so obviously that rendered their cars unusable. And we're talking about dozens and dozens and dozens of cars. And not only had the exhaust pipes been blocked, there were stickers on those cars with a photo of Robert Habeck, who was then the leader of the Greens, vice chancellor. This was just ahead of the election, and the sticker said "Vote Green." So it seemed like fanatical supporters of the Green Party had been targeting German drivers, car owners, with this message to vote for the Greens. Now, the Greens were very supportive, very vocal in their support of Ukraine since the invasion of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So that happened. Then German police discovered almost accidentally that the perpetrators were not green activists. It was just some three or four ordinary guys, and they had been doing it. They had been commissioned by Russia, and what the German investigators discovered was there had been a down payment by the agent who commissioned them, so to do it, and then a pro piece payment, so a payment for each car that they sabotaged. Quite clever, but that's the range I've seen so far. But you can continue to innovate in this space. There is nothing limiting the commissioning party, as it were, from just commissioning whatever they'd like to get done. Because if you are somebody who is well, if you are one of these potential agents, you're not going to say, well, I'm only going to do arson, I'm only going to sabotage cars. You look at what's available, and if you fancy doing it, you might do it.
Yeah, and presumably, if the price is right, then there are certainly, there are certain people in any country that you can find who are prepared to carry out any kind of attack. So it's quite easy to see these sorts of things escalating, and
Indeed, and that's why, for example, the head of MI5 in the UK and other senior security officials have highlighted or pointed out that Russia and other states seem increasingly interested in working with organized crime in our countries, and I think that's because members of organized crime groups are, let's say, more experienced in the more advanced forms of crime than maybe your average teenager may not be able to perpetrate.
No, sure. But there's so Mike Burgess, the head of ASIO in this country, described it as, I think, a layer cake, an expanding layer cake. So clearly there were several steps of disassociation between the Rev Guards in Iran and the people who actually carried out the arson attacks here in Australia. And I think I'm making inferences here, but it seems that organised crime was one of the links. Is that typical that they, the foreign intelligence officers looking to create trouble in another country will go to something like organised crime as a starting point, and then they will find the lower level people, foot soldiers there on the ground, and so you get sort of these several layers of separation between the ultimate puppeteers and the people who actually carry out the stuff on the ground.
That doesn't seem to always be the case, and I think the reason for that is that if you associate yourself as a hostile state, if you associate yourself with a criminal gang, then that gang is known to the authorities. It makes it easier for the authorities to spot and trace. Whereas if you just commission any old citizen, obscure, unknown to the authorities, then it's just much harder for the authorities to have that person on their radar before they act.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, this might be a leap on my part, but I mean, it actually reminds me, in terms of from the perspective of the authorities here, it almost reminds me of lone wolf radicalized, ideological perpetrators. The difficulty for the authorities is precisely the sort of randomness, the lack of previous association with any kind of criminal or extremist enterprise. These people who are sort of self-radicalized, they a bit like the perpetrators that you're talking about here. They from the authorities' point of view, they essentially sort of pop out of nowhere.
They do, and they pop out of an even bigger nowhere than lone wolf radicals, because they don't even need that sort of learning curve of understanding the ideology, whatever it is that has radicalized them. It's just a one-off thing without any emotional, ideological attachment. It's just a commercial transaction.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What about the downsides of this? I mean, obviously they are amateurs. I presume there have been cases where it's been almost sort of clown-like in its ineptitude. I'm just guessing. I haven't followed all of the examples, and obviously Europe seems to be the sort of testing ground for a lot of this. I mean, there are a lot of cases carried out by Russia in Europe. I'm aware that Iran as well, I think, has been involved in Europe, including in your native Sweden, I believe, and to some extent in the UK as well. Anyway, sorry, I'm going off on tangents a bit there, but what are the downsides of using these sorts of amateurs over, say, trained professionals? And are there specific tasks that say the GRU are happy to give to amateurs that they wouldn't give to professionals? Like, if it's a serious job, do they still tend to use their own trained people?
Well, the first obvious downside is that you don't know what you're going to get, so you don't know how skilled the gig worker you've commissioned is at the task that you've commissioned. Which is why I think for the gig workers are used for easier tasks. If you want to assassinate Sergei Skripal, you're not going to just sign up any young teenager, any teenager. That has to be a real professional and somebody with a proper association with your service or your organization. So the downside is it may not be carried out to perfection. But then if it's arson, if it's handing off a parcel bomb, it's not that complicated. And actually, it doesn't really matter whether it's carried out to perfection. In the case of the parcel bombs, it was obviously an extremely fortunate that the bombs were detected before they could go off. They could have caused loss of human life. It would have been a disaster if that had been successful. But the act of dropping off these bombs is not particularly difficult. So the downside is that you may not get a perfectly executed deed. But it doesn't really matter whether it's perfectly executed. What matters is that it causes fear in the country you're trying to target. Yep. And it causes people to feel that the authorities are not able to keep them safe. And we should remember that is the social contract in our Western countries, in our liberal democracies. The government, we hand over power to the government through elections, and the government in exchange looks after certain aspects of society for us, including external and internal security, so that we don't have to arm ourselves in some sort of prepper style or militia style. That is the social contract. If people get the idea that our authorities are not able to look after us, that is a massive win for the other side. And the other upside, I should say, the first downside is it may not be perfectly executed, but actually it doesn't matter much. The other downside is that you look like a rogue state if you target or seek to harm other countries by using essentially crime and even organized crime. Then you look like a pretty unattractive, unappealing country. You look like a rogue state. But Russia, for example, is a country that has already crossed the Rubicon. So it doesn't care whether it's seen as a rogue state, whether it's seen as a disreputable country or regime. It has already made that choice. And that paradoxically makes it or gives Russia and any other country of the same nature, gives them an extraordinary freedom to carry out precisely these kinds of attacks, because they can't be shamed into improving their behavior. It's not embarrassing for them to be found out as having commissioned deeds like these.
It's frightening. I mean, one might almost dare to suggest that stricter sanctions and stronger punishment against Moscow for its wide range of malign behaviour might be in order. But anyway, that's unfortunately I'm not in charge of that situation. But presumably, though, I mean, the deniability is part of the appeal. I mean, like you say, I mean, Russia doesn't seem to care at this point. They've got nothing left to lose in terms of their global reputation. But for other states, I don't know. I mean, Iran, how much Iran cares at the moment is also I suppose is a bit is dubious. But deniability. Is that part of the actual appeal of using these, especially when there's several layers of disassociation?
It is, and so the targeted state may say, we discovered that Russia was behind it, or it may say, we suspect that Russia is behind it, or another country, but if Russia or Russian agents didn't actually perpetrate the deed, or whatever the country is you have in mind, whatever that country is, if you can't establish that their agents, that country's agents, perpetrated the deed, it almost doesn't matter that you say, oh, we think there is a link, we think they commissioned it. So what are you going to do about it? You are not going to be able to arrest any agents for having done it. They are not in your country. That's why they use, that's another reason they use these disposable agents. And so you almost look a little bit crazy as the targeted country if you say, oh, Russia was behind it. Yeah, you can say that all you want, but there are no Russian agents or whatever the country is that perpetrated that deed. So you end up really looking crazy. And I often think of grey zone aggression, of which this is part, as gaslighting, geopolitical gaslighting. So the targeted country knows that something is happening, and it tries to articulate that it's happening, but the other country can say, oh, it's just in your mind. Sure. We're seeing that in so many different iterations, including the use of disposable agents.
Yeah. And I mean, obviously, cyber attacks are the classic example of the ones that are very, very difficult to have that attribution to a level that a country feels comfortable naming the perpetrator. But I mean, the same is true here, and the same is true of all sorts of sort of hybrid and grey zone type activity, which comes back to one of the motivations for doing it. It's an interesting one. Obviously, Tehran has responded with howls of outrage about Australia's overreaction, blah blah blah. But in the case of, it's ASIO intelligence that has actually established this, and obviously the government and ASIO are not going to go into any kind of detail about what proof they actually have, and so we're in my view, perfectly reasonably trusting our government and our intelligence agency on this. But in the case of Iran, it's pretty easy for the government to attribute and impose the strong diplomatic response that they have, which was to turf out the ambassador. But if it were another country, notably one like China, for instance, I don't know whether China is known to have been using these sorts of activities in any significant way, but the government would have a much longer conversation with itself, I think, if it were the case with China, because that's obviously a diplomatic relationship that we're looking to preserve as much as possible. Less the case with Iran, but it puts that. It means that it's the defender that's having to actually go through that agonizing conversation with itself, which again sort of works in the favor of the perpetrator.
It really does. It really does, and. We have seen this across so many different iterations of grey zone aggression. So disposable agents are just the latest innovation to arrive within wider grey zone aggression. But within every category of this really quite unpalatable form of aggression below the threshold of our military violence, the targeted country faces the same dilemma each time. How do we respond other than pointing out that something has happened? Can we retaliate? But in order to retaliate, we would need to ascertain beyond reasonable doubt that a particular country is behind it. And even if we manage to do that, how do we retaliate? We are not going to use the same means against that country. Well, in that case, what means are available to us? We are not going to use the same shady means that they use forms of aggression that they use against us. We're not going to recruit agents to deliver parcel bombs to airliners in their countries because they do that to us. That's not who we are. But what other means do we have available? In the cases where we do manage to establish beyond reasonable doubt that a hostile state was involved. So it really is the defender's dilemma every single time. And we try to name and shame. That doesn't work if that country has crossed the Rubicon from respectable to disreputable country. What other tools are available? And that's the dilemma in which our governments find themselves each time one of these acts happen, and that's increasingly often.
Yeah. It's so unfair, isn't it? It's so unfair.
It is.
God damn it. We can't win. All we can do is not lose as much as possible. You've talked in terms of the strategic purposes of this. I mean, you've talked a bit about sabotage, creating fear, creating mistrust in the ability of the authorities under that social contract that you talked about to keep us safe, to protect us. In the case with this Australian situation, I mean, the way the government described it was to sow division and undermine social cohesion. I mean, obviously, it came after October 7. Not immediately, but in that period in which sensitivities around all related issues were extremely heightened. It was sort of shocking in Australia to see something as significant as the fire bombings of a synagogue and a kosher cafeteria. The level of sort of sophistication, I suppose, and the range of strategic objectives that the malign perpetrators tend to have. I mean, how complex, how sophisticated have you seen them as being? And is this I guess playing into a specific very acute, sensitive political situation, as was the case here. I mean, it was pretty well targeted and pretty well delivered. I mean, I say that with obviously no admiration, but to poke a particular zone and create a particular form of public emotive response, is that normal, or is it tend to be a bit more kind of scattergun? Okay, let's just freak the Europeans out with a whole bunch of parcel bombings and arson attacks and these sorts of things.
So you get activities across the board. Some seem really random and maybe not that well thought out. Some are really quite sophisticated in whom or what they target and how they are executed. But the point is that you can afford to experiment a bit, and different countries work in different ways. So Iran may be more focused on particularly sophisticated operations, whereas Russia may use the watering can principle and sort of just try different things and see what works. And if it's not particularly successful, then no harm done, because we are not going to retaliate, we as the targeted country. So, but what we have seen in recent years is phenomenal innovation. I remember when grey zone aggression was just a few years ago, and it was mostly about cyber disinformation and then the occasional assassination attempt. And targeting of diaspora groups. That was basically it. And in recent years, the past 3 years or so, we have just seen phenomenal innovation where a new iteration of grey zone aggression appears almost on a monthly or even weekly basis. And if I knew who the individuals were in the Kremlin, for example, who are in charge of doing this, I would love to know how they plot this. Do they sit down and say, well, let's look at this particular country, this particular sector, or do they just work independently in the different agencies? I would love to know how that works. Maybe when this whatever it is, new Cold War is over, I would love to go back to the Kremlin plotters and the planners, I should say, and find out how they worked, because the level of innovation is extraordinary, and not just in Russia, by the way.
No, I mean, no. And well, that's something I'd like to get your thoughts on. I mean, one thing is it's not the sort of innovation that our industry minister is usually encouraging us all to pursue. But but
it is. If I can interrupt you, David, it's
sure.
It's almost reflective of the way shadow economy works, or the criminal side of the economy. So the official economy works according to certain processes, and there is innovation. But the shadow economy, the economy that exists illegally, you see phenomenal innovation there by the shady characters who are involved with it, and one almost has to, in a perverse sort of way, respect them for how innovative they are. Obviously, they should be.
Yep.
They should be put in jail and all the rest of it. But there is enormous innovation there, and similarly, there is enormous innovation in grey zone aggression, which is the sort of the geopolitical version of the shadow economy, if you will.
Yep. Yeah. No, I know the feeling, and I get your point about the perverse admiration. I sometimes think, what kind of sick SOB actually came up with this? But but the ingenuity can be really quite astounding. And again, it goes back to that point you made at the start about just how difficult it is for legitimate authorities following the rule of law to actually keep up with it. You did mention the innovation, not just Russia. Just tell me a little bit about I guess the countries involved. I mean, we know Russia, we know Iran, most obviously. Are there others? And is it a case? I mean, has Russia kind of led the way on this? Have they written the textbook as they often have in the past? And say Iran and potentially others are learning from it.
So when it comes to gig workers or disposable agents, Russia seems to be leading the pack. Iran seems to be part of it as well. They are the two leaders there. But within grey zone aggression, the field is much wider. So a country like Belarus, for example, instrumentalized weaponization of migration against Europe, and it did it for its own particular reasons. In coordination with Russia, but it was done by Belarus. And that was the first time we had seen weaponization of migration to that level within Europe. And it continues to this day. And it's not just the first step of bringing the migrants to the border. So issuing visas so that people can come to Belarus, then helping them get to the borders of Poland, Latvia and Lithuania, but then also allowing them to get right to the fences that these countries have now built along their borders that didn't used to be any fences. Now there are fences. And recently we saw, for example, one of these migrants stabbing a Polish border guard to death. So he stuck a knife through that fence and stabbed the border guard to death. Now that is a new spin or twist on the weaponization of migration. It's not just the fact that these people arrive and the countries on the other side of the border then have to figure out what to do. It's also the fact that somebody, a worker, an employee of the Polish state has lost his life as a result of this. Now, NATO always says we defend every inch, every square inch of NATO territory. Well, it was on NATO territory. The bodyguard died defending Polish territory. So it raises the question, is this something, an incident to which NATO should respond, given that it was definitely within Polish territory?
Yeah. Okay. And again, putting the difficult questions in the mind of the defendant there is a very, very powerful tactic. I mean, that idea of the weaponization of immigration and just the extreme case that it reached there, I suppose, goes to the broader question that is, I guess, at the heart of what we're talking about here. And I did have in my mind that I might go into different examples, but I'm just conscious of the time, and perhaps we can sort of start to wrap it up by I'd like to get your reflections on this idea that global connectivity is introducing new vulnerabilities, whilst obviously we want all of the upsides of it, and migration, I guess the movement of people around the world is one instance. Migration has all sorts of wonderful upsides to it. It enriches our societies, it strengthens our economies and all these sorts of things. But it also gives rise, in some cases, when abused, to risks and vulnerabilities in countries, and when it's deliberately used as a tool in the way that you're talking about with Belarus, that's an instance where where growing global connectivity actually becomes a vulnerability. I mean, a couple of other examples that I think of are, threats to the connectivity itself. So, for instance, the global network of communications and information that we have means there are an ever-expanding range of cables lying across the seafloor, and cutting those and actually cutting off a country's access to information is potentially a really powerful way to hurt it. Trade has grown in recent decades to the point now where we have sort of certain dependencies, either as importers of critical goods or exporters. In the case of Australia with China, some of our key commodities, we still rely very, very heavily on one destination for those, and that gives China some power over us, as it very much demonstrated a few years ago. At the risk of my waffling on for another minute or two, perhaps you could just give me some sort of overarching thoughts on that sort of thesis that that there are all these different ways that connectivity is creating new risks, and I suppose how do you see that moving forward as we become ever more connected into the 21st century?
Yeah, so it's funny you should ask, because I'm just now finishing my book about cables,
right,
coming out next year, Undersea War, and it is extraordinary, really. So cables have existed since the 1850s. So they are not an expression of modern economies, but what they have done is explode, as it were, in the past 3.5 decades. Because the internet was invented, which meant that we then needed connectivity much more, meaning we needed lots more cables. Before that, it was telegraph cables, where we don't talk on the phone that much, not even then. But now we need these cables every second of every day, everywhere. And if you are cut off, as happened to the residents of the Matsu Islands, Taiwanese islands, in February 2023, it is utter misery. And I have conducted a mental exercise for myself of trying to spend 1 hour without any sort of internet connectivity. It is misery. And imagine, so that's just a personal, one person experiment. Well, imagine the effect on a country if it were to be cut off from the rest of the world. And it's not just, the fun of surfing the internet, talking to people like I'm talking to you now. It is the entire economy. Virtually nothing is possible without these cables. And by the way, it's not just data cables, it's also power cables. And we need those to keep electricity supply going to either between the mainland and islands within particular nations, or between neighboring countries. It works so well. But there too, the taboo seems to have been broken, that if you want to harm another country, you can target that country's cables, and it can be done with complete deniability, because with the incidents that have taken place in the past 3 years or so, you can reasonably argue it was just an accident. The targeted country can say, we think it looks terribly suspicious, but the crew on the vessel that hits the cable at in any given incident can say, "Oh, we didn't notice a thing." And so as a targeted country or affected country, you look neurotic, saying that you think there was something, that it wasn't just a mere accident. And the only thing that is for sure is that the people in that country will be affected. Fortunately, they haven't been affected as badly as the Matsu Islanders, who lost all connectivity, but that risk exists, and the effect for the operators, the owners of those cables, is very real and enormous. They have to get the cables repaired, often at enormous expense, and yet nobody acknowledges responsibility for it. In some cases, captains of ships have been put on trial, and I think that will be an extremely fascinating trend to follow if they're convicted. One has been convicted in Taiwan, another, as we speak, is on trial in Finland.
Right. It's really fascinating. I mean, the need for resilience in that area is just is clearly overwhelming. It sounds like a great book, and I think I'll certainly keep an eye out for it. And for the audience's benefit, I promise I didn't set that up. I honestly didn't know that Elisabeth was writing that book, but that worked perfectly. I suppose just a final observation, and you can respond to it as much or as little as you want, but the real dilemma for modern states then, and I mean, we're at the southern hinge of Asia, obviously, here in Australia, and we follow closely what goes on in Southeast Asia and the Pacific and these sorts of these neighbouring areas. One of the big I suppose determinations of a lot of states in our part of the world is digitization, and the absolute need for digitization, both to deliver as governments to the citizens, and also to empower and turbocharge their economies. But the bugger's dilemma for them now is that vulnerability grows as you digitize your nation. You can't not do it, because then you're going to fall behind and you become potentially just a backwater of a state or an economy. But the more you do it, the greater vulnerability you bring on yourself, unless we find sort of resilience-based solutions to these sorts of dilemmas.
Exactly. And which country would say, well, let's just not be so dependent on the digital economy? No policymaker would say that. And no policymaker, by the way, would tell people to use the internet less, because the only way we can reduce our dependence on these cables is for us all to use the internet less. Well, which policymaker would make that case? And to any voters, they want to be able to watch cat videos, make digital payments, and other sort of necessary functions of the modern economy are, I think, completely defensible. But we also use the internet for a lot of just silly reasons along the lines of cat videos. But no policymaker would tell the country's, his or her voters or the general public that please use the internet less, so that we are not as dependent on these cables. It's you are not going to win any election.
No, absolutely. And that's before AI, by the way. I mean, it's this is going to compound by orders of magnitude, I think, over the next 10, 20, 30 years as AI becomes integrated more heavily into all countries. And again, if you don't do it, then you're gonna lose out and fall behind. All right, exactly. Elisabeth, look, thank you. Thanks so much for your time. We covered the gig economy for bad guys really, really thoroughly there, and I'm so pleased that we got to touch on your new topic. I mean, you write and speak on so many different areas. You're a real multi-talent. So thanks for coming on, and it was a great chat. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
I hope you enjoyed that, folks. We'll be back next week with another episode of Stop the World.